James Whitaker sat in the dimly lit office of his father's attorney, arms crossed, his expression a mix of indifference and frustration. The old man had passed away a month ago, leaving behind a lifetime of memories, none of which James particularly cared to revisit. Their relationship had been strained for years, and now, as he listened to the attorney drone on about the details of the will, he felt nothing but irritation. "Your father has left you the property in Willow Creek," the attorney stated, sliding a key across the desk. "It includes the old barn, as well as the surrounding land." James scoffed. "A barn? That's it? No money? No stocks? Just a rotting old shack?" The attorney, an older gentleman with a patient demeanor, folded his hands together. "Your father had his reasons. He wanted you to have it." James clenched his jaw. He had been expecting something, anything of real value. His father had worked hard his whole life, but instead of passing down a financial cushion, he had given him this, a forgotten relic in the countryside. It wasn't just disappointing, it felt like an insult. Driving out to the property was an exercise in self-restraint. The road was cracked and overgrown, just like he remembered from childhood trips with his father. The barn itself was barely standing, its red paint peeling, the wood warped with age. He pushed open the creaky doors and let out a long sigh. Inside, dust hung thick in the air. Rusted tools, stacks of old newspapers, and broken furniture cluttered the space. The whole thing felt like a waste of time. He was about to turn and leave when something large, covered in a tattered sheet, caught his eye. James stepped closer, grabbing a handful of the dusty fabric. He gave it a sharp tug, and then he froze. A shape emerged beneath the cloth, something metallic, something old. It was a car, but not just any car. Even through the thick layer of dust and rust, he could tell it was something special. His father had never mentioned this. His heart pounded as he reached out, running his fingers over the cold, forgotten metal. What was this doing here? And more importantly, why had his father never told him about it? James took a step back, his breath shallow as he stared at the forgotten machine in front of him. His hands were still covered in dust from pulling back the old sheet. And for the first time in years, he felt something unexpected: curiosity. The barn had been a tomb for decades, and whatever lay beneath the rust and grime had been untouched for just as long. He walked around the car slowly, his fingers grazing the dull, faded paint. The body was sleek, even under years of neglect. The shape of the headlights, the curves along the side, it had an old-world elegance to it, something rare, something expensive. No, that couldn't be right. His father wasn't a car collector. In fact, James could hardly remember a time when the man had ever shown much interest in cars beyond their basic function. So why had he kept this hidden away, and for how long? James reached for his phone and switched on the flashlight, aiming it at the front of the car. Through the dust, a barely visible emblem gleamed under the light. His brow furrowed. He leaned in closer, wiping away the grime with his sleeve. And then, his breath caught. A prancing horse. He staggered backward. It couldn't be. Could it? His heart pounded against his ribs as he quickly pulled out his phone and snapped a few pictures. A Ferrari. An old one. But how old? How valuable? Was it even real? He knew next to nothing about classic cars, but something about this felt different. He took a deep breath. He needed answers. James didn't waste time. He ran back to his truck, slammed the door shut, and immediately started searching. Vintage Ferrari models, classic Ferrari values, identifying rare Ferraris. With every click, his pulse quickened. Then, after scrolling through dozens of images and articles, he stopped. His stomach flipped. There, staring back at him from the screen, was a nearly identical car, a Ferrari 250 GT California Spider, a model so rare only a handful had ever been made, a model worth millions. James swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the phone. He glanced back at the barn, his mind racing. Could it really be? Had his father been hiding a fortune all these years? Or was there something more to this inheritance than he had ever imagined? James sat in his truck, staring blankly at his phone screen. The image of the Ferrari 2i50 GT California Spider glowed back at him, identical to the dust-covered relic in the barn. He exhaled sharply, trying to slow his racing thoughts. This has to be a mistake. There was no way his father, his quiet, frugal, work-all-his-life father, had owned something this valuable. It didn't make sense. But if it was real... James swallowed hard. He had been ready to sell the property for whatever he could get, thinking it was worthless. If he had tossed the car aside as junk, he would have been walking away from something life-changing. He needed confirmation. Without a second thought, he pulled up a number for a local mechanic, an old family friend named Rick Saunders. Rick had been working on cars since before James was born. If anyone could tell him what he was looking at, it was him. James tapped the call button and held the phone to his ear. "Yeah?" Rick's voice came through, rough but familiar. "Rick, it's James Whitaker." A short pause. "James? Been a long time, kid. What's up?" I found something in my dad's barn. A car." Another pause. "A car?" "Yeah, an old one. A Ferrari." Rick let out a short chuckle. "Well, ain't that something? Your dad never struck me as a Ferrari guy." "Me neither," James admitted. "That's why I need you to take a look at it. I think it might be rare." Rick hesitated before answering. "All right, I'll swing by in the morning. But don't go getting your hopes up, kid. People find rare cars all the time, and 9 times out of 10, it's just an old pile of rust." James nodded, even though Rick couldn't see him. Yeah, I get it. See you tomorrow." He hung up and ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. For the first time in his life, he regretted not knowing his father better. As the night wore on, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his childhood, about how his father had always seemed to be working, always preoccupied with things James never understood. Was this car his secret passion? Or had it been something more? Had his father meant for him to find it? Or had he hoped it would stay buried forever? As dawn broke over the horizon, James stood outside the barn, waiting. He was about to get answers. The morning air was crisp as James paced outside the barn, waiting for Rick. He had barely slept, his mind cycling through possibilities, none of them making sense. Every time he tried to picture his father with a Ferrari, the image fell apart. His father had been practical, disciplined, and frugal to a fault. A luxury car, especially one this rare, didn't fit into that picture, not even close. The sound of an approaching truck pulled him from his thoughts. A beat-up old Ford rolled up the dirt path, kicking up dust as it came to a stop. The driver's door creaked open, and Rick Saunders, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with grease-stained hands and a permanently unimpressed expression, stepped out. "Well, let's see what you got," Rick said, adjusting his cap. James led him into the barn, pulling the doors open to let the morning light spill inside. Dust danced in the air as Rick stepped forward, eyes narrowing at the car. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, without looking at James, he muttered, "You're messing with me, right?" James blinked. "What?" Rick walked up to the car, running his fingers over the dusty hood. He crouched down, inspecting the front grille, then stood up and exhaled. "Where the hell did this come from?" "My dad's barn," James said slowly. "I didn't even know it was here." Rick let out a low whistle. "James, do you have any idea what this is?" James crossed his arms. "I think it's a Ferrari, maybe a rare one, but I don't know for sure." Rick turned to him, his expression unreadable. "This ain't just a Ferrari. This is a 250 GT California Spider, one of the rarest damn cars in the world." James's heart pounded. He already suspected that, but hearing it confirmed out loud sent a shock through his system. Rick shook his head, still staring at the car like it was some kind of ghost. "Last time one of these sold at auction, it went for, hell, close to 20 million. James nearly choked. "Million?" Rick chuckled dryly. "Yeah, kid. Million." James swayed slightly, his head spinning. He had walked into this barn thinking his inheritance was a worthless dump. Now he was standing in front of something that could change his life forever. But that left one massive question unanswered. How the hell did his father get it? Rick seemed to read his mind. James, listen to me. You don't just stumble on a car like this. Either your old man had a hell of a story to tell, or there's something you don't know. James swallowed hard. His father had never been rich. He had never shown an interest in exotic cars. So where did this come from? James clenched his fists. There was only one way to find out. He needed to dig into his father's past, and he needed to do it fast. James sat in his truck outside his father's old house, gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing. Rick's words echoed in his head. You don't just stumble on a car like this. That meant his father had a story, one James had never known. The old house had been locked up since his father's passing, but James still had the key. He stepped inside, the scent of wood and dust greeting him. The furniture was untouched, everything just as his father had left it. He moved through the house with purpose, heading straight for his father's office, a small, cluttered room at the back. If there were answers, they would be here. He started with the desk, rummaging through drawers filled with bills, receipts, and notes. Nothing unusual. Then he opened the old wooden filing cabinet in the corner. More documents, land deeds, old insurance policies, boring, everyday paperwork, until he found the box, a small, locked metal box tucked away beneath stacks of yellowed papers. His heart pounded. He knew this box. He had seen it as a kid, always locked, always off limits. His father had never let him near it. With shaking hands, James picked it up and set it on the desk. He searched through the drawers, pulling them open until at the very back, he found a tiny brass key. His fingers trembled as he slid the key into the lock. With a soft click, the lid popped open. Inside were stacks of old photographs, some black and white, others faded with time, letters worn and fragile, and beneath them a single yellowed newspaper clipping. James pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. The headline made his blood run cold. Multi-million-dollar Ferrari stolen in 1972. Owner offers reward. His breath caught in his throat. He scanned the article. The stolen car was a Ferrari 250 GT California Spider. His hands trembled as he reached for one of the letters, addressed in familiar handwriting. To my son, James. His chest tightened. This was from his father. With a deep breath, he unfolded the letter and began to read. James, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you found the car. I never wanted you to know. But the truth is that Ferrari has been my biggest secret and my biggest regret. I was just a mechanic back in '72, working at a shop when a man came in, frantic, offering cash to hide the car for a few days, said he'd be back. He never came. I was young. I didn't ask questions. I should have. I kept the car, convinced no one would ever find it. I told myself it was my reward for keeping my mouth shut, but I knew the truth. It was never mine to keep. I'm sorry, son. I hope you do what I never had the courage to. Dad. James sat there, staring at the letter, his hands shaking. His father had spent his entire life hiding this car. And now it was up to him to decide what to do with it. James sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in his hands. His father's words weighed on him like a ton of bricks. All these years. The old man had lived his entire life carrying this secret, burying it deep, never speaking of it. And now, the truth had landed squarely in James's lap. The Ferrari wasn't just his inheritance. It was a stolen treasure. His father had spent his life running from a choice he made decades ago. Now James had to make a choice of his own. Do I keep it? Do I sell it? Or do I give it back? The thought of walking away from millions made his stomach twist. This car could change his life overnight. But he also knew that his father had carried regret until the day he died. James clenched his jaw. He couldn't do the same. His fingers hovered over his phone before he made the call. It took days of research, a trail of emails, and phone calls to old records departments. But eventually, James tracked down the original owner's family. The man who had lost the Ferrari back in 1972 had passed away years ago, but his son, Michael Harrington, was still alive. The moment they spoke, James knew he had made the right choice. Michael was in disbelief. We thought it was gone forever. My father never stopped looking. He told me about that car every year on his birthday, how it was the biggest heartbreak of his life. James swallowed hard. He thought of his own father, of how his life had been shaped by regret. I just want to do the right thing, James said. Arrangements were made. When the day came, James stood in the barn one last time, running his hand over the Ferrari's hood. For a moment, he imagined what life could have been like. Millions in his pocket, a new beginning. But this wasn't his to keep. It never had been. When the transport truck arrived, James watched as the Ferrari was carefully loaded onto the trailer. It was leaving his father's barn for the first time in decades. Michael met him at the auction house, where the car was to be authenticated and returned to its rightful place in his family's collection. He reached out a hand, shaking James's firmly. You could have kept this a secret, Michael said. You could have been a rich man. James smiled slightly. Maybe, but some things are worth more than money. Michael nodded, then handed him an envelope. James frowned. What's this? Something my father would have wanted, Michael said. A thank you. James opened the envelope and nearly dropped it. Inside was a check for $2 million. I can't take this, James stammered. Michael chuckled. You can, and you will. His expression grew serious. My father believed in doing right by people. You honored that. Now let me do the same. James stood there, stunned. His father had spent a lifetime hiding the truth. But by finally setting it free, James had been rewarded in a way he never expected. As he walked away, check in hand, he glanced up at the sky and smiled. Guess you were right about that barn, Dad.